The first explosion struck without warning, a blinding flash in the cold morning sky, followed by a rising cloud of black smoke drifting over the Pacific. 10 miles behind, another B-29 crew watched in horrified silence as the giant bomber tore apart mid-air. No enemy fighters, no flak, just a sudden violent breakup that left behind only burning wreckage and raining fuel. Within weeks, it happened again. Whole crews vanished between takeoff and the horizon, their last words dissolving into static. At the center of these vanishings was the aircraft once hailed as America's engineering miracle, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. It could soar higher and farther than any aircraft before it, carrying the nation's last hope within its pressurized hull. But beneath its shining metal surface lurked a deadly flaw. The B-29's engines were erupting in flames without warning, sometimes moments after takeoff, sometimes hours into flight. Each time, the result was the same: a fire no pilot could survive. In 1944, Boeing engineers in Wichita faced their worst nightmare. They had created the most advanced bomber in existence, yet statistics revealed a grim truth. More than 130 planes had been lost, not to Japanese firepower, not to sabotage, but to fires born inside their own wings. Mechanics called them ghost flames because no one could trace their cause. Investigators changed wiring, modified cowlings, reworked fuel lines. Nothing stopped the destruction. The mighty Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, intended to be symbols of power, were killing the very men they carried. By midsummer, fear ran through every hangar. Pilots refused missions, ground crews whispered rumors, and officers demanded answers that no one could give. The official reports blamed overheating under stress, but airmen knew better. They could feel the trembling through the yoke, smell the oil before the fire began. Something deep within the machine was breaking unseen. Then in a noisy hangar far from the polished offices, one grease-stained mechanic noticed something odd. His name was Sergeant Edward Ramsey, 32, a quiet man who trusted his hands more than books. Working the night shift, he helped strip a burned-out B-29 engine and found a coupling bolt that seemed wrong. It wasn't broken. It was polished smooth by friction, worn as if grinding against its housing. Holding it to the light, he muttered, "This is too tight." Others dismissed him. The torque readings were perfect, the manuals followed. But Ramsey couldn't ignore it. That small observation began a chain reaction that would save hundreds of lives. In that moment, he was just a tired man in a hangar, staring at a thumb-sized piece of metal, wondering why bombers kept falling from the sky. Outside, rows of B-29s waited for missions, each holding 11 men. 11 souls balanced on a single bolt, the narrator's tone softens. History doesn't always shift because of generals or scientists. Sometimes it turns because one ordinary person refuses to overlook what feels wrong. If you believe ordinary people can change history, type 1 in the comments. If you think heroes only wear medals, hit like. And if you want to know what this mechanic discovered inside America's deadliest bomber, stay until the end, because his mistake would save more than 600 men from burning midair. By spring 1944, the B-29 had become both a symbol of strength and a silent killer of its own. Designed to strike Japan directly, it embodied cutting-edge innovation, pressurized cabins, remote turrets, and 4 2,200-horsepower engines lifting 10 tons of bombs across oceans. Yet those same engines betrayed their crews. In every squadron, one phrase echoed before takeoff: "Let's hope number 2 holds." Everyone knew why the inner left engine, number 2, had become cursed. Time after time it failed first, igniting without reason, turning the bomber into a fireball. Between March and August 1944, out of 184 B-29 losses, 117 were traced to engine fires or explosions during climb. More than half. Behind Wichita's hangars, wrecked engines were stacked like gravestones, each twisted hulk once carrying 11 men. The cause wasn't sabotage or neglect. It was buried deep within the design itself. Engineers knew the Wright R-3350 engine was pushing the limits of what wartime technology could handle. It was an 18-cylinder radial giant built for raw power, not forgiveness. Each cylinder ran hotter than any air-cooled engine before it. During test flights, temperatures inside the cowling reached over 500 degrees, hot enough to melt solder and turn oil into carbon sludge. Pilots tried everything to control the heat, throttling back, opening cowl flaps, changing fuel mixtures. Nothing worked. Sometimes the blaze began during climb, engines straining at full output. Other times it struck without warning. One pilot, Captain Paul Hensley, recorded it in his diary. First a flicker on the temp gauge, then the smell, sweet, metallic, like burning oil, then a red glow. "You can't see the fire at first," he wrote, "but you feel it. The vibration changes pitch, and then the wing starts glowing orange like a forge." The R-3350's power came from complexity. To squeeze maximum thrust, it used a maze of oil lines, pressure couplings, and exhaust ducts twisted together like arteries. But those arteries lay too close. Engineers suspected oil spray was hitting overheated manifolds. Others blamed poor internal airflow, a baffle flaw. They tried everything: wind tunnel tests, extra flaps, heat-resistant coatings. The fires continued. By July, the losses were undeniable. General Curtis LeMay, head of the new 20th Bomber Command, demanded action. "We're losing more planes to our own engines than to the Japanese," he warned Boeing's men. "At this rate, Tokyo will never see a bomb." The Army Air Forces created a crash task force, codename Fire Trace. It united experts from Boeing, Wright Aeronautical, and the Air Materiel Command. They tore down engines, tested fuel blends, studied scorched fragments. Every test ended in the same uncertainty. At Wichita, the tension was suffocating. Workers knew what was happening, but had orders they couldn't stop. 50 new bombers per week. Some left the line gleaming anew, while others still burned on the runway. Mechanics worked sleepless nights, praying each takeoff wouldn't end in fire. Pilots joked bitterly, calling the B-29 the $600,000 lighter. One morning, flight engineer Lita Don Bay stood beside a new bomber and told a reporter, "You don't fear the enemy. You fear catching fire before you ever see him." The newspaper ran the photo captioned, "Confidence in the new bomber." No one missed the irony. Even Boeing's own test pilots, men like Edmund Allen and Al Reed, legends of the flight program, were shaken. In February 1943, Allen himself died when a prototype B-29 caught fire on takeoff and crashed into a meatpacking plant near Seattle, killing 31. Engineers called it a freak tragedy. Now, a year later, the same disaster repeated in Kansas, Guam, India. Every report concluded the same: probable cause, thermal overload due to oil system failure. But what kind of failure? No one knew. The oil lines were checked, bolts torqued perfectly, fittings sealed to spec. The numbers didn't add up. Some aircraft flew 1,000 hours safely. Others burned after one mission. Inside Boeing's test hangar, engineers mounted transparent cowls and film cameras to watch airflow and oil behavior mid-run. Frame by frame, they studied the shimmering heat, the mist of oil, but no ignition source. Exhausted, a senior engineer scrawled a note after 16 hours. "The cause must be mechanical vibration. Something small. Something we can't see." The words hung in the air like prophecy. Something small. Something invisible. The narrator's voice drops. Every great machine conceals a secret, a flaw unseen, deadly, waiting for the right vibration to awaken it. For the B-29, that flaw hid inside a single joint smaller than a man's thumb. The war demanded speed, precision, and faith in manuals, but faith alone wasn't enough. As summer 1944 dragged on, Kansas skies filled with contrails and funerals. New bombers took off, old ones didn't return. Engineers kept searching, pilots kept dying. And in the back of a dim maintenance hangar, one grease-stained mechanic was about to make a choice that would change everything. If you believe the deadliest mysteries of war come from the smallest details, type 1 in the comments. If you think it was just bad luck, hit like, because in the next chapter, you'll see what happens when one man breaks the manual and saved 600 lives. By August 1944, the investigation had turned into a manhunt, but the fugitive wasn't a man. It was a flaw, a tiny, invisible defect killing faster than enemy guns. In Hangar 5 at Boeing's Wichita plant, blackened engine parts lined the walls. Teams worked under buzzing lights and the thick scent of burnt oil and solvent. Their words were few, their faces hollow. Fatigue set in across the plant. Every night brought another field report, another B-29 lost to mysterious fire, another 11 names crossed from the roster. The fire trace team had been assembled from the best minds America could offer. Metallurgists from Wright Aeronautical, fluid dynamics experts from Caltech, Air Force engineers trained in crash reconstruction, all gathered under one roof. Their command center looked less like a lab and more like a war room, walls plastered with charts, vibration graphs, and scorched engine blueprints. Yet the conclusion never changed. No single point of failure identified. The Wright R-3350 was too complex, its interlocking systems creating problems faster than they could be solved. Every fix generated new data, new theories, no solutions. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Lindstrom, the lead investigator, paced the hangar floor like a man haunted. "Somewhere in this machine," he told his team, "something small is doing something big. Find it." They tried everything, altering oil grades, changing cooling ducts, rerouting ignition wires, but the fires continued. They swapped entire engines, only to watch fresh ones burn. Every breakthrough dissolved in smoke. Fuel lines were blamed first, then the magnesium cowling that could ignite at 1,000 degrees. For a brief moment, they believed fire shields around the turbo ducts had solved it, until a 40th Bomb Group B-29 exploded, leaving high-low. The report was clinical. Engine number 2 fire, origin unknown. Aircraft lost. No survivors. In the hangars, silence replaced optimism. Mechanics stopped joking. They barely spoke at all. They simply worked, hands moving automatically over metal they no longer trusted. The R-3350 had become a living creature, furious, unpredictable, waiting to kill. The narrator's tone hardens. "Every machine speaks in patterns," Lindstrom wrote in his notes. "The B-29's problem is that it's screaming in noise." The 18-cylinder vibration was so violent that instruments couldn't read it properly. Oscillations blurred into chaos until the numbers were useless. And yet, buried in that chaos, the truth waited. One night around 2 a.m., a test mechanic stayed behind after his shift. Sergeant Edward Ramsey wasn't part of Firetrace, just one of hundreds tasked with tearing down engines for inspection. The others had gone home hours ago. While wiping down a coupling assembly, he noticed something strange. The threads on one oil pressure bolt were smooth, mirror bright, not stripped, not cracked, just worn by friction. Bolts didn't polish themselves. He loosened it carefully and ran his thumb over the edge. The steel felt warm, though the engine was cold. Ramsey frowned. He'd handled hundreds of these fittings and never seen one like it. Grabbing a torque wrench, he checked the resistance. 85 FTLBs, exactly per the manual. Perfect. On paper. But something was wrong. The next morning, he brought the bolt to his supervisor, a civilian engineer named Hal Peters. Ramsey explained the vibration scoring and faint heat marks. Peters barely glanced up. "It's within spec," he said flatly. "If we start questioning specs, we'll never finish this war." Then he turned back to his clipboard. Ramsey said nothing and walked away. That night he couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the dry, metallic squeal the bolt made when it turned. The sound of metal fighting metal. What if that friction was feeding directly into the oil line? What if each vibration created micro-heat, a spark too small to see? Over the next 2 weeks, Ramsey started keeping secret notes on every engine he serviced. Serial numbers, torque readings, humidity, even the date of last maintenance. Unauthorized documentation, But he didn't care. Patterns emerged. Every burned engine had one thing in common. Its coupling bolts had been replaced during field maintenance. Different suppliers, slightly different alloys. Microscopic differences, deadly results. He took his findings to the firetrace team. They listened, then dismissed him. "Vibration isn't the cause," Lindstrom said. "It's a symptom." But Ramsey knew machines. He could hear when they were afraid. Then came another report, a test flight over Texas, gone in a flash of flame. 11 dead. Ramsey slammed his wrench onto the bench. "You keep chasing big answers," he growled, "but the devil's hiding in the small parts." That night, he broke the rules. Without clearance, he swapped a standard steel bolt on a training aircraft with one made from soft aluminum, lighter, flexible, technically wrong. It defied every engineering principle in the book. Then he ran the engine for 6 hours. No overheating, no fire, perfect stability. The next day, that same bomber flew 4 missions, all without incident. The data was undeniable. The vibration that once shattered steel had been absorbed instead of resisted. A flaw invisible to theory, but obvious to touch, simply flexed through the softer metal and dispersed the vibration harmlessly. The narrator pauses. Every great discovery in war begins with an act of defiance. While generals spoke of duty and valor, a mechanic in Kansas had quietly broken every rule and uncovered the truth that hundreds of engineers had overlooked. If you believe that sometimes disobedience saves more lives than obedience, type 1 in the comments right now. If you believe rules should never be broken, hit like instead. Because in the next chapter, you'll see what happened when this mechanic's forbidden fix reached the desks of the United States Army Air Forces, and how one illegal bolt would decide the fate of 600 men. The morning of September 19, 1944, began like any other at the Wichita test field. Cold prairie wind, a grey sky, the steady growl of engines echoing across the tarmac. But for Sergeant Edward Ramsey, it was a morning heavy with a secret that could either save hundreds of airmen or destroy his career. He had installed the wrong bolts in one of the B-29 test aircraft, an act of deliberate defiance against the sacred Army Air Force manuals. The plane was logged as U-42-63643, a training Superfortress assigned to vibration trials. No one beyond his small crew knew what he'd done. Ramsey had replaced 12 hardened steel couplings on the oil pressure manifold with soft aluminum alloy bolts, the kind meant for light-duty systems. He'd done it by flashlight the night before, hands slick with oil, muttering to himself, "If steel can't bend, it breaks." It wasn't science. It was instinct. At 800 hours, the engines thundered to life. Ground test. No smoke, no fire. Oil temperature steady at 240 degrees, cooler than any previous trial. Ramsey stood outside the hangar, rag in hand, pretending not to notice. By noon, the aircraft taxied out for a full-power climb. He watched as it lifted into the haze, silver wings glinting. At 500 feet, Engine 2, the cursed one, held steady. At 1,000 feet, still no rise in heat. By 1,500 feet, one of the engineers muttered, "This is impossible." Ramsey stayed silent. Captain Ray Hanlon, the test pilot, radioed down, "Engine steady, all temps green, smoothest flight I've had all month." 6 hours later, the plane returned intact. The crew disembarked laughing. For once, nothing had gone wrong. But the victory was short-lived. That night, Chief Inspector Hal Peters discovered the altered maintenance log. The deviation was obvious. Within hours, Ramsey was summoned to the operations office. The meeting was swift and merciless. "You modified an active aircraft without clearance," Peters snapped. Ramsey didn't deny it. "Yes, sir. Do you understand that's a direct violation of military regulation?" Ramsey's reply was calm. "I understand that 11 men died last week because we followed that regulation." The room fell silent. By dawn, word had spread. Colonel Lindstrom, head of the Firetrace project, ordered the plane grounded and the bolts removed for inspection. Ramsey's commander demanded a court-martial for willful negligence. Paperwork began immediately, but Lindstrom hesitated. He'd seen the test data. For the first time in months, a B-29 had flown without a single thermal spike. 2 days later, he ordered a controlled experiment. 2 identical aircraft, one fitted with standard steel bolts, the other with Ramsey's soft aluminum versions. Both would fly under the same load, same altitude profile, same power output. Ramsey wasn't allowed near the hangar, but he waited beyond the fence as the engines roared. At 12,000 feet, the first plane, with steel couplings, began to overheat. Oil pressure fluctuated, temperatures spiking past 280 degrees. At 13,500 feet, the number 2 engine failed. The pilot shut it down and returned to base. Meanwhile, the second aircraft kept climbing. 15,000, 18,000, 20,000 feet, smooth as glass. When it landed 3 hours later, engineers rushed to inspect the engines. Not a single trace of wear. The soft alloy bolts had flexed just enough to absorb the harmonic stress that had been cracking the steel fittings. The results were undeniable. Ramsey's mistake had solved the mystery that had defeated every mind on the Firetrace project. Yet officially it was a scandal. Admitting the truth meant admitting that the Army's own specifications were flawed, that hundreds of men had died because of a line in the manual. For 3 days, the officers argued. Some wanted to bury the findings. Others demanded Ramsey's quiet discharge. Then General Curtis LeMay arrived for inspection. Known for his temper and bluntness, he read the report in silence. "So this man broke procedure and fixed the problem?" "Yes, sir." LeMay paused, then said, "Then promote him before someone else takes the credit." The order never reached paper, but LeMay's word carried weight. Within weeks, he gave verbal authorization for Ramsey's modification to be tested fleet-wide. 2 weeks later, every maintenance crew in the 58th Bomb Wing received updated torque and bolt replacement instructions, all derived from one mechanic's act of defiance. The vibrations simply flexed through the softer alloy and faded harmlessly away. The narrator pauses. Every great discovery in war begins with disobedience. While generals delivered speeches about bravery, a mechanic in Kansas had quietly broken the rules and uncovered the truth hundreds of engineers had missed. If you believe that sometimes defiance saves more lives than obedience, type 1 in the comments right now. If you think rules should never be broken, hit like instead, because in the next part, you'll see what happened. When this mechanic's forbidden fix reached the United States Army Air Forces, and how one wrong bolt would decide the fate of 600 men. The morning of September 19th, 1944, began like any other at the Wichita test field. Gray skies, cold prairie wind, engines rumbling against the hangar walls. But for Sergeant Edward Ramsey, that morning carried the weight of a secret that could either save his comrades or end his career. He had installed the wrong bolts in one of the B-29 test planes, a quiet act of rebellion against every Air Force. Regulation, the aircraft's logbook listed it as 40-63643, a vibration test Superfortress. No one outside his maintenance. Team knew that Ramsey had replaced 12 hardened steel couplings on the oil pressure manifold with soft aluminum bolts, parts normally used for auxiliary systems. He had done it by flashlight the night before, oil on his hands, muttering, "If steel can't bend, it breaks." It wasn't theory. It was instinct. At 800 hours, the engines roared to life. Ground test. No smoke, no fire. Oil temperature steady at 200 psi, the lowest ever recorded. By noon, the bomber taxied out for a climb test. Ramsey stood outside, pretending not to watch. At 500 feet, engine number 2, the cursed one, held steady. At 1,000 feet, still smooth. At 1,500, an engineer whispered, "This is impossible." Captain Ray Hanlon, the test pilot, radioed down. "All temps green. Smoothest flight I've had all month." 6 hours later, the plane landed safely. For once, nothing had gone wrong. But that night, Chief Inspector Hal Peters, found the altered report. Within hours, Ramsey was summoned. You modified an active aircraft without authorization. Peter snapped. Yes, sir, Ramsey replied. Do you realize that's a violation of federal regulation? I realize 11 men died last week because we followed that regulation, Ramsey said quietly. The room fell silent. By dawn, the story had spread. Colonel Lindstrom, head of Fire Trace, grounded the aircraft for inspection. Ramsey's commander wanted him court-martialed. Paperwork already underway, but Lindstrom had read the test logs. The numbers were perfect. 2 days later, he ordered a comparison. 2 identical bombers, one with standard bolts, one with Ramsey's at 12,000 feet. The standard bolt plane began overheating. By 13,500, engine 2 flamed out. The pilot returned to base. The second aircraft climbed higher, 15,000, 18,000, 20,000 feet, smooth as glass. When it landed, engineers tore down the engine. No damage, no vibration scars. The softer bolts had absorbed the resonance that shattered steel. Ramsey's mistake had solved the unsolvable. But officially, it was chaos. Admitting the truth meant admitting the Army's own specifications were wrong, that hundreds of deaths traced back to a design flaw. For 3 days, officers argued, bury the finding or punish Ramsey quietly. Then General Curtis LeMay arrived. He read the report in silence. So, he said, this man broke the rules and fixed the problem? Yes, sir, LeMay nodded once. Then promote him before someone else takes the credit. The order was never written. But his decision stood. Within 2 weeks, new instructions circulated through every maintenance unit in the 58th Bomb Wing. Adjust oil coupling fittings with modified tolerance to reduce harmonic vibration. No mention of Ramsey. No mention of the wrong bolt. But the fires stopped. Ramsey, however, was quietly suspended for unauthorized modification of government property. For 90 days, he swept hangar floors, cleaning oil pans while watching the bombers. He had saved takeoff in perfect rhythm. Each night, he listened to their engines fade into the distance, steady and safe. That was enough. When the base commander asked if he regretted it, he said simply, "Only that I didn't do it sooner." The narrator pauses. In every war, there are men who win with courage and men who win with wrenches. Ramsey had done both. His rebellion earned no medal, but it silenced the ghosts haunting the Superfortress. If you believe saving lives is worth breaking the rules, type 1 in the comments. If you think discipline should always come first, hit like instead, because in the next part, you'll see what happened when the Army finally faced Ramsey's forbidden fix, and how 600 men owed their lives to one mechanic's so-called mistake. 3 weeks later, a plain manila envelope marked "Confidential" slid under Ramsey's bunk. Inside, a single page stamped with the Air Materiel Command seal. You are hereby ordered to appear before the Technical Review Board. Airfield Operations Division, Wichita, Kansas. Date October 12, 1944. Charge: unauthorized modification of aircraft. Hardware during wartime production. Penalty: dishonorable discharge. Or worse, that morning the base was quiet. The last test flight had landed safely. No smell of smoke lingered. Yet Ramsey felt like a condemned man walking to the gallows. For weeks he had watched flawless takeoffs, knowing his wrong bolt had saved them all, but the system valued rules over reason. The hearing was held in a converted hangar. 3 officers behind a long table, the air thick with fuel and paper dust. A stenographer clattered away as proceedings began. Colonel Lindstrom sat as a witness, not an ally. The chairman, Colonel Harland, adjusted his glasses. Sergeant Ramsey, do you admit to altering military aircraft components without authorization? Yes, sir. Do you understand that such actions endanger flight safety? With respect, sir, Ramsey said, the danger was already there. I stopped it. A civilian Boeing engineer leaned forward. How exactly did you stop it? Ramsey explained his theory: vibration, resonance, and the softer alloy that absorbed energy instead of fracturing. He spoke with calm conviction. ends unconsciously miming the wrench's twist. When he finished, the engineer muttered, "Impossible. We ran those numbers 100 times. Ramsey looked him in the eye. "Then maybe you ran the wrong numbers." The room went still. Colonel Harlan cleared his throat. "Sergeant, you're not an engineer." "No, sir," Ramsey said. "I just fix what breaks." Outside, a row of gleaming superfortresses waited for takeoff. Everyone fitted with Ramsey's modification. Everyone in that room knew it. They also knew that acknowledging it publicly would expose Boeing and the Air Force to questions they couldn't afford. How many letters had said mechanical? Failure instead of design flaw? Silence filled the hangar. Then Lindstrom spoke. "Gentlemen, before judgment, I submit the last 10 test logs under the revised protocol." He handed them the folder. 0 fires, 0 vibration failures. "These results," he said, "are the direct outcome of Sergeant Ramsey's modification. If we discharge him, we must also ground every plane that carries his fix." That changed everything, the officers whispered among themselves. When they returned, Harlan's tone had softened. "Sergeant Ramsey, your actions violate procedure, but the board acknowledges their effectiveness due to wartime secrecy. Your discovery will remain classified. You are not to discuss it with anyone. Understood?" "Yes, sir." "Good. You'll be reassigned to non-flight maintenance duty until further notice." It wasn't punishment, but it wasn't freedom either. Ramsey saluted and stepped outside. The afternoon sun glared off the polished wings of a departing B-29. The engines thundered, smooth even, alive. He watched it climb higher and higher until it vanished beyond the horizon. A mechanic beside him murmured, "You fixed it, didn't you?" Ramsey didn't answer. He just gave a small smile and walked back toward the hangar. That night, the official review board report reached Washington. Its tone was clinical, stripped of emotion, deliberately vague. Field modifications applied to oil coupling assemblies have resulted in significant reduction of thermal incidents. Recommend adoption of revised torque specifications for all units operating R-3350 engines. No mention of Ramsey, no acknowledgement of the defiance that had saved the bomber fleet. Yet within days, the order spread through every Air Force maintenance depot. By the end of October, every B-29, from the Marianas to the Aleutians, was flying with the new soft alloy fittings. And the fires stopped. In the months that followed, mission completion rates soared. The same aircraft that once terrified its own pilots became the weapon that would end the war. Ramsey returned quietly to the night shift, saying nothing about what had happened. His fellow mechanics knew, of course. They'd seen the difference. They called the change Ramsey's trick, but only in whispers. When one of them asked if he'd ever been officially thanked, Ramsey shrugged. "I don't need a medal," he said. "Just engines that don't burn men alive." The narrator's tone softens, reflective now. Sometimes history hides its heroes in plain sight, not in cockpits or command posts, but in hangars where men with dirty hands choose conscience over orders. Ramsey had defied command to protect life, and for that he was punished in silence. Yet every time a B-29 returned home intact, his defiance lived on in the steady pulse of its engines. If you believe following your conscience is the truest form of duty, type 1 in the comments right now. If you believe rules must always come before instinct, hit like instead and stay tuned, because in the next part, you'll see what happened after the war, when Ramsey's secret finally surfaced, and how one wrong bolt became aviation legend. By the winter of 1944, something extraordinary had happened, something beyond logic or luck. The fires had vanished. Across the Pacific, from Tinian to Saipan, squadrons of B-29s flew missions once thought impossible. In November alone, over 400 sorties reached their targets without a single engine fire. Commanders noticed it first. Morning reports that once listed aircraft lost, cause unknown, were now blank. It was as if the Superfortress, once cursed, had forgiven its makers. Engineers credited routine maintenance improvements, but the men on the flight line knew better. They called it Ramsey's miracle, even though his name appeared nowhere in the paperwork. Every new B-29 that rolled off the assembly line carried soft alloy couplings and revised torque settings. The manuals were quietly rewritten, and accident rates plummeted by 93%. The B-29, once feared as a death trap, became the most dependable long-range bomber ever built. In a letter dated December 14, 1944, Colonel Lindstrom wrote to Air Materiel Command, "The mechanical instability previously observed in oil coupling assemblies has been completely eliminated. The solution, though unconventional, has proven durable and safe under all operational conditions." He never mentioned Ramsey by name. He didn't need to. Everyone who'd been in that hangar knew who deserved the credit. By spring 1945, the modified engines were flying over Japan. Every mission was a silent tribute to one mechanic's persistence. When the bombers returned from long-range raids, crews would walk down the line, pat their engines and whisper, "Thanks, Eddie." They didn't know him, but they trusted his work, and that trust carried them home. Statistically, the results were staggering. Between September 1944 and the war's end, B-29 mechanical losses dropped from 1 in 20 flights to fewer than 1 in 200. More than 600 airmen, 600 fathers, sons, brothers, lived who would have died not from enemy fire, but from their own engines. 600 families never got telegrams. In the post-war review, the Army Air Force's official report contained a single, sterile line. Engine modifications applied in late 1944 eliminated chronic thermal incidents. That was all. No name, no citation. The war ended. The world moved on. Ramsey didn't. When news of Japan's surrender reached Wichita in August 1945, the base erupted in joy. Mechanics danced on the hangar floors, waving rags like flags, champagne bottles clinking against toolboxes. Ramsey stood apart from the crowd, watching a formation of B-29s thunder overhead, their engines glowing steady in the fading light. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel proud. "They made it," he said softly. "All of them." He left the service a few months later. No medals, no commendations, just a folded discharge letter thanking him for faithful service to the United States Army Air Forces. He took a job repairing tractors on a Kansas farm, later opening a small auto shop on Kellogg Avenue. To the locals who came in for oil changes, he was just Ed, the quiet mechanic who never spoke about the war. A quiet man who never overcharged and always checked every bolt twice. The years drifted by. The war faded into history. The B-29 became a museum relic, its story sealed behind glass. Then in 1983, a retired journalist named Harold Benton began researching a book about forgotten wartime engineering breakthroughs. While combing through declassified archives, he found a maintenance memo stamped "Restricted," an unapproved field modification performed by Sergeant E.R., Wichita Plant, September 1944. Benton followed the trail and found an address in Kansas. He drove out to a small garage off Kellogg Avenue, where a thin, white-haired man worked under the hood of a dusty Ford pickup. When Benton explained why he was there, Ramsey looked up, smiled faintly, and said, "You're about 40 years late, son." The article that followed was titled, "The Wrong Bolt That Saved a Generation." It appeared first in a small aviation journal, then spread quietly among veteran circles. Letters began arriving at Ramsey's shop, some from old mechanics, others from pilots who had flown the Superfortress. One note read simply, "I was over Tokyo in April 1945. Number 2 never caught fire. Thank you." Ramsey pinned that letter above his workbench and never took it down. In 1986, the Air Force quietly amended its engineering history to acknowledge an anonymous maintenance correction that resolved the R-3350 oil coupling issue. It wasn't full recognition, but it was something. In the margin of that entry, an archivist penciled a small note, believed to be Sergeant Edward Ramsey, Wichita, 1944. The narrator's voice softens. Not every hero ends up in textbooks. Some remain hidden in footnotes or in the quiet hum of an engine that never fails. Ramsey's act of defiance became part of something greater than himself, a legacy built not on glory or promotion, but on the belief that doing what's right matters, even when no one sees. Every time a mechanic tightens a bolt, every time a pilot trusts his machine, a trace of that belief endures. If you think small actions can change history, type 1 in the comments. If you believe only big heroes make a difference, hit like instead. Because in the final chapter, we return to where it all began, the hangar, the noise, the flame, and discover what Ramsey's story really means for anyone who's ever had to choose between rules and what's right. The hangar is silent now. The tools are gone, the walls bare, dust coats the cracked concrete. Only echoes remain, the ghostly vibrations of engines that once shook the earth. In one corner, sunlight filters through a shattered window, falling across an old wooden workbench. Burn marks scar its surface. Fingerprints of oil are pressed forever into the grain. This is where it happened, where a mechanic once stood against a machine that was killing his friends and decided he wouldn't let it. History remembers the generals, the medals, the flags. It rarely remembers the men who worked in the shadows, wrench in hand, keeping the engines alive. Edward Ramsey never led a mission, never designed an airplane, never fired a gun. But he did something harder. He questioned what everyone else accepted. He looked at the manuals, the sacred laws of procedure, and saw they were wrong. And without permission, he made them right. It didn't win him glory. It nearly ended his career. But it also saved 600 men who came home, held their children, lived to grow old instead of dying inside a firestorm sky. The world never knew their names, and most never knew his. But the distance between life and death, between destruction and deliverance, was measured in the width of a single bolt and the courage of one man who refused to let it fail again. The narrator's voice deepens. What Ramsey did was more than a fix. It was a statement. Real integrity isn't blind obedience. It's knowing when the rules have failed. Every engineer, every soldier, every leader faces that moment when conscience outweighs command. The manuals tell you what's safe. Your heart tells you what's right. The world changes when you choose the latter. The lesson reached far beyond one Kansas hangar. The soft bolt principle, Ramsey discovered, became the foundation of post-war vibration control. It found its way into jet engines, spacecraft, even the pressurized cabins of Apollo. His name was never attached, but his idea lived on. To future engineers, it was just another line on a blueprint. To Ramsey, it was proof that truth matters more than credit. Machines are honest, he used to say. They don't care about rank or regulations. They only respond to truth. That truth survived him. You can still find it in every safe takeoff, in every vibration damper, every flexible joint that keeps a machine alive under impossible stress. All are quiet descendants of one man's forbidden thought. The film reel of history moves forward. The war ends, the factories go silent, the planes become exhibits behind ropes and glass. Visitors read the plaques, dates, specs, missions flown. They admire the shining metal, but never see the flaw that almost destroyed it, or the hands that made it whole again. Yet if you listen closely in those silent halls, you can almost hear it, the hum of a steady engine, the whisper of oil flowing through a line that no longer burns, the echo of a mechanic's voice saying, "If I don't fix it, they'll die." The narrator pauses. There's something sacred in that kind of courage. It doesn't shout. It doesn't ask for reward. It's the quiet conviction that one small act of defiance can mean the difference between tragedy and survival. That's why Ramsey's story matters, not because it's grand, but because it's ordinary. Because someday, each of us will face our own version of that choice. Maybe not with engines and wrenches, but with the same test of honesty. The world still runs on bolts, on unseen things that hold it together. And like Ramsey, we are all responsible for keeping them from breaking. So next time you hear an airplane overhead, remember this. Somewhere, decades ago, one man decided that being right mattered more than being safe. That's why the engine still runs. That's why they all came home. If you believe courage doesn't always wear a uniform, Type 1 in the comments. If you think small acts can change history, share this story. And if you want more true stories of ordinary people who quietly shaped the world, subscribe and stay with us. Because though the war ended 80 years ago, its lessons remain, written not in medals or manuals, but in the oil-stained hands of men like Edward Ramsey. 7 months. One mechanic, one bolt. 600 lives. That's how history turns, quietly, stubbornly, on those who refuse to look away.